Welcome to the Tame Valley Wetlands. 18 miles and 1,000 hectares of hidden, ecologically rich landscape, following the River Tame, its tributaries, and on the doorstep of over 1 million people. From the river itself to the floodplains and the surrounding woodland, there is so much to celebrate and discover. Throughout the next 6 vlogs, we're going to show you not just the wonderful beauty of this landscape, but importantly how we're trying to conserve, protect and regenerate, whilst focusing on its rarest and most endangered inhabitant, the stunning, charismatic willow tit, in a project we're calling On a Tree by a River.
So yeah, as I said, it's just a little snippet there of our work that we've been doing, just a little introduction. And if you enjoyed that and if you enjoyed the footage there, then please do go and check out the other vlogs we've done and check out some of the other work that Simon has done as well. So what I'll do now is I will jump into my presentation and get ready to go with that. Let me get my screen share going. Oh. I'm using the mouse pad on my my laptop, and I'm not used to using it, so apologies there. Okie dokie, so hopefully you guys can all see that okay. So yeah, as you heard there in our little vlog, our project is called On a Tree by a River, and that is obviously what we're all about in the Tame Valley. We work within that river valley and try to conserve and look after as many of the different species that live there. I'm Susan Hartland Smith, as you can see on the screen, and I'm the Community and Volunteer Officer in the Tame Valley Wetlands team. And there's a few of us in the team there. We're based in a little office in a place called Hams Hall, which is not that far away from Tamworth. And as Nicola pointed out, the bottom of the area that the Trent Valley is covering. Sorry, it's so hard work. Trent Valley, Trent Valley, Team Valley. There's so many of them. So I'm the lead on the project. I do all of the boring things that are based in the office really, and Helen, who you saw in the film there, is our project officer. She's out and about on the ground doing all of the delivery and getting to do all the nice outside work. So where are we? For those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with the Tame Valley, we are kind of right in the middle of England. We are in the Midlands. We're sat a little bit over to the side, and we do go just slightly south of Tamworth, so there's a little gap in between us. But we do cover a huge area down from Lady Walk Nature Reserve, which is a West Midlands Bird Club reserve, and we cover all the way up to the top of RSPB Middleton Lakes. So some locations there that you might be familiar with. And this project in particular is looking at a few of the nature reserves along the stretch, and we also have a little bit that comes out of the top away from Middleton towards the west along the Langley Brook, which I've not included in this map because I didn't have such a pretty map for it. We also not only cover the River Tame, but we also cover the rivers that come into that, so things like the River Cole and the River Blythe, and as I said, the Langley Brook. And I will actually talk about those a little bit later on in my talk. So our project is pretty ambitious, to be honest. It's a 12-month project. It's funded by the Severn Trent Biodiversity Boost Fund. Through that, we've been able to write quite an exciting project. There's not a lot of knowledge about willow tit, shall we say. They're not particularly secretive, but they just seem to be not so well known. They're relatively boring little birds, some would say, but I think they're fantastic, and they're very interesting actually when you watch them and see what they're up to. Our project is to try and help bring those willow tit back from near extinction. As I said, an ambitious project. What we're trying to do is enhance the habitat that we have in the valley. So there are some willow tit strongholds up there in the Middleton Lakes. We know there are some down in Lady Walk, and there are records of them in other areas up and down the valley. We know that we've got these two really good strongholds though. So what we want to do is we want to enhance those, make those the best they can possibly be. And we also want to create more habitat. We want to be able to have more willow tit in the area, support more numbers of them. And obviously it's incredibly important to link all of this habitat together. How are we going to do that? Well, we've got 17 kilometres of river to work on, so we've got quite a big job. And what we've said, what our target was we wanted to do 10 hectares of habitat, either enhancement or creation. Some numbers, we've got 1,100 trees to plant, but that's already because we've been gifted some, which was very exciting. 1,000 volunteer hours we want to contribute to the project, and then we've also got all sorts of really nice things around that project as well, like the video blogs we've also got blogs on the website. We've got talks such as this one. We've got other community events that we're really hoping we'll be able to take part in this year. We're sort of heading towards that moment, hopefully. So fingers crossed we'll all be able to get out and about quite soon. And well, why did we choose willow tit as our project? These numbers, 94% decline in willow tit numbers between 1950 and 2012 is huge. It's put the willow tit on the UK red list species of highest conservation concern, which means that it's imperative that we do something to try and help these birds, try and bring them back from the kind of the brink of extinction. And the reasons behind these massive declines is generally due to loss or changes to habitat. Willow tit are a little bit picky about where they want to live, so we need to be mindful of that when we're doing works. And as is the case with a lot of species, when we change habitat or when we lose habitat through whatever reason that may be, we also lose species, or we push them down to much smaller numbers than we used to have, which is a real shame. But you know, the project is here, and we're aiming our absolute best to try and improve the numbers that we've got. So willow tit, a few of you will probably have been fortunate enough to see them. I only ever saw my first ones this year as part of the project. I didn't think I was going to. I didn't think I was going to be lucky. They were tricksy little things. But I was fortunate enough to see them, and for those of you who haven't, there'll be plenty of pictures through the talk. In this picture, we have a willow tit in the top right, but we also have a marsh tit in the bottom left, and they are very commonly confused, and up until incredibly recently were actually considered the same species. And it was only after proper scientific study that they discovered that they were two quite different species. And rather confusingly, marsh tit actually live in sort of mature or semi-mature woodland, and willow tit will live in what we would call wet woodland or a kind of carr woodland. And it's still, I'm sure you can see from these two pictures, very difficult to tell a difference between the two. I've got some fantastic pictures that I've been able to use through this presentation, but when you're sort of out in the field and you've got your binoculars and you're trying your absolute best to work out what on earth it is that you've seen, it can be incredibly difficult. And I'm not going to say that it gets any easier, but if you can get this close to them, then you have a little bit more of a hint. And we still have the marsh tit on the left and the willow tit on the right. And the marsh tit has a small white mark on its beak. So if you are fortunate enough to have some binoculars or maybe to be able to get up close, they do readily come to feeders, and you can see this difference, then you can see which one is which. And obviously you're not always going to have them next to each other, but this is the best way that people have been able to tell the difference between the two. And that's how we've been doing it as well when we've been out in the field. So, as I said, willow tits, they're a little bit picky, but they're not super picky about where they want to live. But what they do like is they do like it to be a bit of a messy home. This picture in the top left looks like incredibly scruffy bit of scrubby woodlands. We've got some brambles in the front there and some sort of low growing scrub that's sort of brambles in the background, and then going into some willow trees. And to a willow tit, this is the ideal home. This is what they're looking for when they go on Zoopla. They're like, oh yeah, this is absolutely the best thing for me. They've got nice young woodland and it's got all this overgrowth around, which makes them feel safe and secure from predators. In the bottom right hand picture, we have a young woodland. So again, young trees, this is a plantation woodland, and the trees are all of about the same age, but there's not much growing on the ground here. And for willow tit, they're just not as interested in that. It might be the perfect house, but it's not the perfect garden. And those are the kind of things that we're looking at to try and improve in the work that we've been doing. This is a dead tree growing. It's not even growing. A dead tree in amongst some young plantation. So it's not quite so brambly here. But what we need is this dead wood, and I'll go on to explain a little bit more about that shortly, because the willow tit actually nest in dead trees. So not only do we need young woodland for them to nest in, but that also needs to have dead trees within it. And you can see here that what they do is they actually excavate a nest into that dead wood to be able to make their nests. So what we did to start with was try to get a bit of a baseline. There have been surveys on willow tit up and down the valley in the past, and it's something that happens year on year, and we also wanted to continue with this. In 2020 it was a little disturbed, obviously due to the crisis, but we managed to get some data, and we've obviously continued that this year. It's really important for us to get this information because it means that we have an idea of how many birds there are and where they are, but also where they aren't, because for us that's just as important as knowing that they're present, because that way we know maybe where we need to do a bit more work, or maybe where there's some kind of issue that we're not aware of that we need to help with, means that the birds can then move into that area. So what we have is a little speaker that plays the willow tit call. Willow tit are quite territorial, so they will come to that sound, and then we can see them and we can say, yes, they're a willow tit here. We also, in some of the areas that we work, so down at West Midlands Bird Club, quite a number of the birds have a ring on them, so we can even manage to identify different individuals as well, which again is fantastic because you can see if you have the same individuals coming into the same area. So the other thing that we did, of course, along with trying to find out where the willow tits are present and where they're not present, is we did walk over most of the valley to see where the good habitat was, where the bad habitat was, where the gaps were, where we could make improvements, and where we didn't really need to do anything. We knew we have these two great strongholds, one at the top and one at the bottom. The habitat there is obviously good for willow tit. Is it good enough? Could it be better? That kind of thing. One thing we are quite aware of is that the pairs that we have in the southern part of the valley have very small territories. Willow tit have been found to have quite huge territories, and there's been quite a lot of study on them. And it's amazing just how big their territory is compared to something like a blue tit, which we obviously see quite commonly in the garden. A willow tit will have a big, I can't remember, it's something like 4 to 7 hectares. These huge, huge territories that they have. And we know that the ones in the south part of our area are using much smaller territories. And this is obviously because they're not able to find enough space to move into, and they're kind of tolerating having a neighbour nearby. But it does mean that more often than not, perhaps any young that they have nowhere to spread into. So we walked the valley and had a look to see what we could do, what we could see. Here, the first picture I have for you is an area that has a bit of rhododendron in. It's one of those species that we try to take out of woodlands as best we can. It doesn't do any good for the soil. It not only shades it out, but it also just means that nothing can grow underneath it. And believe it or not, behind all of that vegetation in front of us is actually a pool. And what we wanted to do in this particular area was to clear out this vegetation that we don't want. And that means that we can either introduce new trees ourselves or allow ones to just get there naturally, and hopefully get a bit more light onto that pool as well. So here you can see the area after we've cleared off the rhododendron, and then you can now see that the pool is there in the background. One of the things that we are looking at doing in this particular area here is to expand that pool a little bit, and I'll mention that a little later on as well, about some of the larger scale work that we're hoping to do, if not now, then potentially into the future. It's not just myself or Helen that are out there doing the work. We've been able to have some volunteer work, and this is something that we obviously wish to do a lot more of in the future. It's been a difficult 12 months, and hopefully as we head into some form of normality, we'll be able to get our volunteers back out and about. But we did manage to have a few sessions with them, and they did some fantastic work. Again, clearing some patches. You can see it's quite soggy where they are. The dream here for this section is to clear out some of the vegetation. We will maybe remove some of the more mature trees in an area so that younger ones can grow through. You end up with a different age of tree from young to old. But also here we're opening up this wetter section so that it might be an option for us to remove some of the soil. That means that it can then be more of a pool, which is the kind of thing that the willow tit is looking for. And then, as I said, we did some days with volunteers, and then sadly we were back to just being able to do work with staff. And I have to say the team did an absolutely phenomenal amount of work over the past 3 months. They've cleared all sorts of debris and trees and all sorts of things. You can see in the front of this picture the stump of the tree that Eddie has actually just cut down, and it's opened up a huge area there, which is a nice mixture of some nice young trees. Again, an area that will kind of go a bit wet, a bit soggy, which is sort of the reason we want the wet woodland. Is it actually means that the trees will die ultimately. So it seems counterintuitive to have a woodland that's wet, but what it means is that the trees will die, which obviously then gives the nesting habitat for the willow tit to be able to make their homes. And it's not just woodlands. This is a picture of the Tame, actually, right next to our office. And you can see that on the left bank, we have some good sort of trees and a bit of scrubby. And on the right-hand side, it's quite open. And if I take this to the next picture, it's the same field. This is just looking in the other direction. And you can see it's very, very open in this area. This part of the project is just below where Lady Walk is, where the West Midlands Bird Club is. And this is the area that the willow tits will have to spread into. They don't really have much choice. And what we want to do in this area is to actually fill some of those gaps in. Willow tit are only a very, very small bird, and if you've ever watched something like a blue tit or a great tit, they don't tend to fly over large open distances very often. They'd rather flutter from some bushes to another little bush and into a little tree, and they feel much safer in those more protected areas. So the whole idea with this is that we can go from bush to bush, and the birds will be safe and they can travel through this area. Now, it's not just about creating somewhere for them to nest and to live their sort of spring and summer, but we also need to provide them with areas where they can find food and areas where they can shelter, and obviously places for the fledglings to learn and grow up and all of that kind of thing. So when we're looking at a project, it's not just about, oh, we need to increase willow tit numbers, so we need to increase where they're going to nest. We need to think about it from start to finish. It's very much the same that we need somewhere to live and sleep and work. The birds are very much the same. They need to have enough space to be able to do all of these kind of things. So one of the kind of funny things about willow tit is that they do excavate these nests. They're such a small little bird, and they will chew away with their beaks into a tree and make a rather small nest, even though they are a small bird, but it is a very small nest. And they will do a new hole every single year. They never go back to that same hole that they made. They will sometimes use the same tree, but they never use the same nesting hole, which is amazing to think how much effort they must put into making those nests every single year. And then they don't revisit them. You would think that they would make the perfect nest and then use it year on year, but they don't do that. They sort of prefer silver birch, willow and alder, but they have been seen to use other trees. The sort of silver birch seems to be a good preference. I think it's probably softer and perhaps rots more easily, and therefore they can get into it and kind of make a decent nest. They favour, as we were talking about earlier, these smaller trees, so only up to about 20 centimetres in diameter, which is tiny really when you sort of look at a tree. It's really very small, and that's why the focus of our project has been on this young woodland and about creating areas of regrowth in the more mature woodland, because then we're giving the opportunity for willow tit to sort of spread into areas of woodland they wouldn't necessarily have been able to. They'll be able to find somewhere to nest. Now, one of the ways that you would normally quickly be able to increase the availability of nest sites for birds is to put up some nest boxes, but willow tit don't like nest boxes. There is some study that's been done to create the perfect willow tit nesting box, and there's been some success with that. But what we decided to do was focus our efforts on what we know they like the best, which is dead wood. And to do the best thing that we can do, we can't just suddenly create dead trees. So we strap dead wood to living trees. And it's been a journey around the valley, collecting up various pieces of rotting wood that we can find. And we attach these to trees, or the picture in the middle, I was actually able to wedge some nice long pieces of dead wood in amongst this mayhem in the middle of all of these trunks. What's also interesting about willow tit is they tend to nest incredibly close to the ground. Normally, again, when you're putting up a bird box, perhaps in your garden, you might think, oh, I'm going to put that just above my kind of head height for things like blue tits and sparrows. They quite enjoy that kind of height. Willow tit will nest perhaps maybe a metre off the ground. They will nest higher, but they tend to fit in this kind of metre to metre and a half, which is incredibly strange for a creature that's obviously trying not to be predated, but that's why they like the messy woodland, because their holes are more hidden in amongst all of that overgrowth. So when we're putting our deadwood up, we don't necessarily need to be climbing up trees and working out how to strap that on. You can just stand it on the ground and try and wedge it in amongst the vegetation there, or we attach to lower pieces of trunk nearer to the ground. And what I've got here is a picture that shows, on the right there, you can see nicely zoomed in where willow tit has been excavating. And one of the things they will do is they'll have a bit of a try at a piece of wood. So they might have a go, it's not quite right, they'll leave it, they'll go off somewhere else, and they'll make their nest somewhere else. But they remember where they've tried this hole, and quite often we find they come back the following year and it's just right. It's exactly what they wanted, and now they finish excavating that hole and they move in, and that's just really, really interesting to think that they, you know, they'll have planned for years in advance as to where they're going to have their nesting sites. So I've talked about all of the things that we've done. We've got an awful lot more to do. We've got lots of plans for our summer coming up, and what I'm really hoping is we're going to be able to really get that community involvement. We're really going to be able to get lots of volunteers out and about to help us. What kind of things have we got going on come the summer and into the next winter that we've got? We've got lots of invasive species removal. That's mainly things like Himalayan balsam. One of the difficulties of working in a river environment is that you get quite a lot of Himalayan balsam. It's just something that we've kind of gotten used to. We've got a program of removing this, and in areas that we've done it, we've been really, really successful. We've managed to push back the kind of spread of that. There's not a lot we can do when it floods, but generally speaking, we've been really, really successful, and we've managed to actually completely clear areas of balsam. And we do that in several different ways. We might get people in with a brush cutter, and they can cut that down for us. We have volunteers that will do that as well, but we also pull it out. As it's an annual species, it has a tiny, tiny little root to it, and it pulls out of the ground really nicely. And it's funny, it's one of the activities I find quite rewarding as work, because you can really see where you've been when you've done some Himalayan balsam work. You start off and you just look in front of you and it's just a field of green, and then it's all gone. And it seems a little bit drastic, but that's what we want. We want it to all be gone, and then our native species can grow back, and they're obviously better for wildlife. So the other things we're looking at doing, we've got lots of community events planned. Some of those are going to be things like bird box building, and as I said before, we have a little bit of knowledge that willow tips will use certain types of bird box, but what we're going to be looking at is making bird boxes for other bird species. One of the things that has been found is that when boxes have been put up in an area with the hope that willow tit will use them, more often than not they get used by blue tits. A lot of us, I'm sure, have either had blue tits nesting in the garden, or have friends, or have seen other people and have watched things like Spring Watch, and they'll readily use the box. They probably prefer them over anything else. And one of the problems that we found in areas where nest boxes have been put up for willow tit is that they've been taken over by blue tit instead, and the willow tit have actually been pushed out of that area because they sort of are in a very similar niche. They compete for food and that kind of thing. So the blue tits don't like the willow tits being there. The blue tits are ever so slightly bigger, so they're the bullies, and they push the willow tits out. So one of our community events will be about bird box building, but it'll be about building boxes for other birds. And the plan for those is that we will put them in other areas, so areas we know that are not suitable for willow tit but are absolutely fine for other birds such as blue tit or great tit, and they will hopefully work and live in those areas, and the willow tit will be able to thrive in the areas that we've been trying to make perfect for them. Some of the work that we're doing now is wetland work. We finish all of our woodland work obviously before the birds start getting ready for spring, but we don't stop working ourselves. We have to keep going, so we're on to wetland work. And actually just on Monday this week, there were a few of us out and about, and we planted some plug plants into a wetland meadow and into a small wetland scrape, which is a sort of a small depression in the ground that's not necessarily as deep as a pond. And that's the kind of work we're doing now. So it's, again, another great piece of work to do. You end up filthy by the end of it, digging through wet mud, making some of the most wonderful noises that you possibly could with your wellies and your spade, and it's a great one to be getting involved with volunteers, and I'm quite pleased that we're doing that now, because it looks like we might be able to get out with volunteers again soon, and that'll be really, really good. Obviously on there it says more woodland work. We'll never stop, but that's not until next winter. We stop at this time of year, as I said, because we're in spring and obviously the birds are there and we don't disturb them, and we don't start again until sort of October, November time, when all of the breeding season is over. The one thing that we can still do at the moment for another couple of weeks or so is tree planting, and we've got a few trees in so far this year, but we have a few more to go in, and we'll also put some of those in the autumn, give them a nice head start before winter kicks in. The reason we're doing some tree planting is partly for this gapping up that I was talking about, so where we're trying to take the willow tit across a landscape, we will do some tree planting for those to be able to let them spread. But we will also be doing some tree planting in areas where maybe the species diversity isn't quite right, but we know there are willow tit nearby. So we might introduce some species like silver birch. As I said before, they're great for the nesting habitat. And if we introduce those into sort of the edge of a wet woodland, what will happen is those trees will grow up, but they won't grow to maturity because they'll succumb to the fact that it's a little bit wet there. That will eventually kill them off, and then those trees will be perfect habitat for the willow tit. And of course, we'll be doing more callback surveys. The guys at the moment are still out there. We start the surveys in February and we run them through till the end of March. We may run into April this year. It's been quiet for willow tit so far. That's our report back. We've not necessarily had as many sightings as we would have liked. So we may run into April just to see if we have any luck a little bit later. It might be that they've decided to start breeding later on in the year and it does no harm. And we'll see what we get back. And we will obviously do further surveying next year, and hopefully we will continue that year on year. RSPB have a regular survey that they do, and we're hoping to just stretch that out along the length of the valley so that we're getting data for the whole valley in one thing. As I keep saying, a lot of this work is volunteer dependent, and we couldn't do any of the work that we do if we didn't have volunteers to help us. We need all those extra pairs of hands and all of those wonderful helpers to come out and join us and get muddy and get the thrill of being involved in some work outside. And fingers crossed, we'll be able to do that soon. There's been quite a big wait for everybody, and I think everybody's quite looking forward to getting out and about again, and I certainly am. So hopefully, yeah, we'll be able to get out with the volunteers again soon. And it's not just willow tits. Our Tame Valley Wetlands team do an immense amount of work for such a small team. We and there's also, while I'm thinking about it, quite a few members of the Tame Valley team watching, so and present. So well done to all of them who've done work in the past and who are doing work into the future. It's really important to us that we look at the Tame Valley as a whole landscape. It's not just a particular species or one particular river or one particular habitat type. Even though it's on a tree by a willow, on a tree by a river, the Willow Tit Project, it's not just about willow tits. It's about improving the entire landscape for everything that lives there. And by improving parts of it for willow tit, we're also improving parts of it for many different types of invertebrates, for example, who have a huge range of things that they need to live in. But by having areas of wet woodland, you're making pools and ponds where the early stages of many different types of invertebrates begin, and that kind of thing. And not only do we do practical work on habitats, but we also do practical work of a historic value. Our Tame Force team built this roundhouse at our Hams Hall Centre, and if any of you are ever fortunate enough to come and visit us, perhaps for some training or to volunteer yourselves, you will see this. They built it from scratch out of mud and horse poo and reeds, and it's taken them a year to build, and they are incredibly proud of it, and as well they should be. It looks like it's on fire, but I promise you it's not. We have a fire on the inside of it in order to dry it out, and on this particular day it was also incredibly cold, so it's actually steaming away to help keep it dry. Our Tame Force volunteers work up and down the valley on various different jobs and various different projects. And this is just one of the many things that they've done, and it's just a fantastic thing that we can use. And what do we use that for? Well, we use it for education. We have lots of education visits come to Hams Hall. We have a lovely little pond here, but we can also teach them about the history of people and about the history of the valley itself. Anyone who is aware of Hams Hall and the Hams Hall industrial estate that's there will know that around us is incredibly urban and industrial. And from many of the pictures that I've shown you so far, you can really hide quite well that industry is there. There's obviously a pylon perhaps in the background, or you might hear an airplane go over, but it's still a wonderfully green landscape that runs through the middle of this incredibly industrial and urban landscape. And to be able to educate children about how people have used that landscape and how that landscape is now and what we can do to improve it and what we can do to look after it is a really valuable thing for us to be able to do. Another project that we have going on is called Love Your River Cole. This is a project, another one that I lead on. Its name gives it away. It works on the River Cole. That feeds into the Tame itself. And this project is another big one. We were very fortunate enough to get some extra funding for it, so it's continuing into a second phase. This is a huge partnership working with Birmingham and the Black Country Wildlife Trust, Castle Bromwich Hall Gardens, the community group B37, the various different councils up and across the area, all along the River Cole. And this is a huge community project. This is all about getting people involved. And what's lovely is the Cole obviously feeds into the Tame, and part of what we're looking at is making improvements along that. And our Willow Tip project feeds into that as well. So whilst the Willow Tip project is just on the Tame Valley, this River Cole Valley that goes off in towards Birmingham is also being considered and also being thought about as part of the Willow Tip project, because obviously it's not just one thing happening in one place. We like to try and get as much done as we possibly can in an area. So the Love Your River Cole project, again, is another one that's going to have lots of volunteer engagement. We're hoping to be able to get people out and about in lots of really exciting river related activities. This one will have things where people can learn about what lives in the river, what lives on the banks of the river, and that kind of thing. And again, lots of really nice education for children and for adults as well, of course. And for this, I would say, please look out on our website, because there'll be quite a lot of training coming up for that one. And then the other thing that we do is a lot more work on the Langley Brook. So I mentioned that one right at the start. We have one of our volunteers here who is doing a kick sample. Now, this is for a lot of the science that we do. We don't just kind of guess the work that we're doing. We use baseline survey data to know what is there, what isn't there, as I said, for the willow tips. And that's the same for in the water as well. It's a lot more difficult for us. You can't just look at it and go, oh, there are things in there. We have to get in there ourselves. And again, our volunteers are in there and they have a look, they see what they can find. And it helps us to make a decision as to what we can improve, whether improvements even need to be made in the first place. And we do a lot of this kind of science in the work that we do, because it's what guides us, it's what helps us to know that we're doing the right things and that we're making the right choices. And like I said, right back at the start, why did we choose willow tips? Well, that's because we knew that the numbers were declining, but also we knew we had these populations in the north and in the south. And thus, if we can spread that population throughout the area. So it's not sort of just a guesswork. It's all got lots of science in it. One of the things that I will be doing a lot more of over the next few months in the Willow Tip project and the Love Your River Cole project is a lot of what we call citizen science. And that will include several different feeds into that. There will be training sessions, there will be like events that people can come to and join in and learn more about any of the projects that we offer. We will collect data at those. We'll do things such as bio blitzes, where we blitz an area and try and find as many different bits of life as we can, be it plant or bird or mammal or anything we can find. And what I'm aiming to do is to get everybody trained up with all of those skills, so that then they can go out and they can carry that on themselves and feed that back to us. So on the Love Your River Cole project, we'll be able to send people off onto the river and they'll be able to look for particular things, which will help us to guide future projects. It's the same for willow tips. All of our callback surveys are being completed by volunteers, and hopefully as the years continue, those volunteers will be able to continue to do those callback surveys and be able to feed that information back into us, which will help us to decide what future projects we want to do and what kind of expansions we can do on a project. The Willow Tip project is only 12 months long, so it finishes in March next year. What we are hoping for is that this will have acted as like a type of pilot project. It's quite common in the wildlife and conservation sector that we do almost like a scoping year on something to try and find out as much information as we can, deliver as much activity as we can, but all of that is feeding in, all of that is working together to be able to then say, this has been incredibly worthwhile, this is what we found out, and we would like to continue to do this. And that is our ultimate goal with any of the work that we do. But in an area like the Tame Valley, because it's such a fantastic habitat, it's so diverse, and I'm sure a lot of you will have heard all sorts of information about how our kind of water-based habitats are often forgotten. It's hidden perhaps in the water. Certainly our marine environments are forgotten a lot as well. And it's just really important that we keep going and we keep trying and we keep doing things like we're doing. So yeah, absolutely. That is my last slide. It's absolutely nothing to do with the Tame Valley, to be honest. I just like this picture. I appreciate I finished a little early there. So I thank you all very, very much for listening to me go on about willow tits. Hopefully it was interesting for you, and if you've got any questions, as Nicola said, we are going to have a chance to go through those. I don't know, Nicola, if you wanted to do a few now and then pause at 8, because I know that some people wanted to stop for the remembrance that was happening at 8 o'clock.
Yeah. Well, the chat box has been very quiet actually, and I'm going to take that as a sign, as everyone's just been transfixed by what you're saying, and listening so hard that they haven't had a chance to write any questions. So for me, as I mentioned at the beginning, I used to work at Hams Hall Environmental Centre. I used to work on the Tame Valley Wetlands project. So I just loved that talk, just seeing the images, seeing the video at the beginning, the landscape again. It was just lovely for me to watch it myself, and such an interesting project and such a great, very well thought through about what you've been doing and the reasons behind it all. So yeah, there haven't actually been any questions come in. So does anybody want to kick us off with a question to start with? You can type it in the chat. You can raise your hand. There we go, from Erica. How do we volunteer?
What an excellent question. So the easiest way to join us as a volunteer is to get in touch with us. As I've said, we've been in a bit of a pause. So it's been a really difficult situation for us. One of my favourite things is to get out with volunteers, and to have not been able to do that has been an absolute disaster. I've been trapped in my house for over 12 months now, and I'm desperate to get out and about, and it's nice to hear that you asking that question. One of the things that we're going to do tomorrow, hopefully, if I get it to Nicola, is when she sends the information to you guys for feedback, there will be some information in there about volunteering, and it will be one of those situations where you'll get in touch with us, and as soon as we can, we'll be able to get you guys out and about. What I will say is you can find Tame Valley Wetlands and Willow Tit and Love Your River Cole, for the sake of argument, on Facebook, Twitter, and the websites. So if you don't necessarily have the information from us there, then please just go on those websites, find our email addresses, and just get in touch with us. I'm more than happy to hear from anybody.
Yep, I can include all of those links in the email when I send that out tomorrow as well. So I'll include all of the links to Sue's project, to Tame Valley Wetlands. We have got a few questions coming in to the chat box now, but I think what we'll do is we'll pause. We'll have our 5-minute break here now. So we have these in our Trent Talks just to give you a chance to stretch your legs, get away from the screen for a few minutes, and as Sue said as well, if you did want to join the remembrance at 8 o'clock as well. So what we'll do, we'll break for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back together and we'll go through the rest of the questions. So if you want to pop any questions in the chat, then please do, or if you want to just ask them afterwards, then we'll go with that as well. So right, we'll see you in 5 minutes then, everybody. All right then. So we've lost a few people who had to leave it a little bit early, but that's fine. That always happens. And we've had a few more questions in the chat box as well. So I think some people are maybe still having a break. So can see that there's a couple of ex-Tame Valley Wetlands staff popped up in the chat here as well.
Thankfully, they've not asked me too difficult a question.
No, I don't think so. I can still see lots of videos and mutes are off, so maybe just wait another minute or so just to see if people are popping back.
Yeah, no problem. Unbelievably, the plumbers are actually still here.
Oh gosh, they're working late.
They really are. But I think our boiler is now on, so that's exciting.
Yeah, at least you didn't lose it in the cold snap.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been clinging on ever since we moved in here a few years ago, and it was just finally we thought we really should get that sorted.
Perfect. Right. Well, I can see a few more people have joined us back again now. So it's not just me and Sue chatting to each other. So we've got a few more questions in the chat box. Thank you very much, everybody, for using that. So the how do we volunteer? You've addressed that one. And do you ring bark trees to create standing deadwood? And that's from Lawrence.
Yes. So we haven't yet in any of the work that we've done so far, because we were quite pressed for time and obviously for numbers of people that we had. But yeah, ring barking trees is something that we've done. We just try our best to do it in quite a sympathetic way. A lot of the sites that we're working on have got quite a lot of public access, so we're very aware of the fact that we don't want to be ring barking trees that might fall down in not the best locations. So what we tend to do is try and focus that attention somewhere where either there isn't any public access or where it's very limited. But it's very effective. And actually at the Lady Walk Reserve, the West Midlands Bird Club Reserve on the south part of the valley, they do ring barking quite a lot of the silver birch there. And it's been really, really effective. Obviously it kills off the tree, and then they have had successful nesting in those as well. So that's great.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Next question then from Ian. How large scale are your habitat recreation projects? An acre, a hectare bigger?
So some of them are pretty massive. I mean, if some people would count the whole of our Tame Valley Wetlands as one creation improvement patch, depending on what we're trying to do. But if we were to look at what our Willow Tip project was aiming to achieve, it was aiming to work on 10 hectares, and that's not 10 sort of solid hectares in one location, that's smaller bits. So if I think about where we were working on Monday, it's a bit of kind of open grassland where we were trying to plant some trees and put those plug plants in. The area there that we were working in that we would class as the area of improvement was probably about 2 hectares. Some of the land that Helen and the guys have been up on RSPB Middleton Lakes, they've maybe worked on a woodland that's about 0.5 hectare. And then one of the pieces of land that we're looking at that's quite open at the moment, where we're trying to do that gapping up and make those links of the scrubby habitat so the birds can work between. I mean, one of those I think is about 15 hectares, so that's quite huge. And we don't necessarily do work on every single inch of those 15 hectares, but obviously by doing some work in that area, it's the entire space that you're improving.
Brilliant, thank you. From Simon then, has there been a lot of general public interest, or is it mainly from existing birders?
It's been a mixture. I would say the majority has been from people who already are engaged in the area, so be that volunteer groups that already exist, or birders or birding groups that already exist. We've obviously had an awkward year, so it's been difficult to be able to do the kind of more wide scale community engagement that we would do. I have done some shocking community engagement recently that is just the worst video you could possibly see. I've stepped out into TikTok. That was amusing. It's terrible. very, very bad at it, but it's fun and it's silly and it does engage with people. But it has been more of the kind of known entities so far, but that's why we're desperately trying to get these community engagement events going so that we can try and get the wider community involved, because obviously just having us interested in it is fine, but we would love to be able to get some new people engaged and get more volunteers, get more people interested. So yes, thanks, Simon.
Not that I have TikTok, but if I did, I'd look you up. From Eliza, is it possible to circulate a copy of the presentation? So Sue, well, that's up to you if you want to send me a copy, or if you'd rather not.
It's a bit of a challenge. A lot of the photographs that are included in it are only for kind of internal communications, so I appreciate it's going on a video, but that is obviously all tagged and that kind of thing. If I was to share the presentation, people might remove the pictures. I'm so sorry. What I could do is I can quite happily take the text and perhaps turn that into some kind of PDF or something like that you could include to send around with people if they wanted.
Yeah.
But yeah, just because the kind of the copyright part of the pictures means that I'm not allowed to share it.
Yeah. But we will be popping this up onto YouTube as well. So if that's helpful to kind of flick through and rewatch the presentation that way as well, then I'll share the link to the YouTube video for people as well if you want to rewatch this talk. And also from Eliza, how does removal of large trees when creating suitable willow tit habitat affect other bird species for the area?
Oh, great question. We are obviously very mindful of what we're doing. We don't want to destroy the habitat of one species just to improve the habitat of another. That's quite literally the last thing that we want to do. But I mean, it's a great question to ask, because we are kind of focusing on what we're doing. We're not necessarily wiping out a huge area. So if we've got a large semi-mature, mature woodland, we're not going to be taking out hundreds and hundreds of trees from there. We might only do some small work on the edge, or we might do what I class as like a wedge going in from the side, and that might only remove 5%, possibly 10%, but unlikely of the trees in there. And even then it wouldn't be every single one in that wedge. We'd be selective of what we do, because we do the work in winter, which is outside of the breeding season for most species. We're not kind of affecting their behavior at that point because they're not necessarily there. And then when they come back, there's still plenty of habitat for them to use to nest and to feed. But I mean, it's a great question. It's one of those we just have to be really, really careful with what we do. Obviously, we do it a lot, and you become quite skilled in being able to know where and when and what you're looking at.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. Then from Jane, what is the population of willow tits in the Tame Valley?
So it's not massive, I have to say. I think last year there were 3 or 4 nesting pairs down at the Lady Walk Reserve, and the same again up at the Middleton Lakes up at the top. We know there are ones in between, but there's not necessarily records of a pair of them. It'll be maybe sightings that we've had from people, or perhaps where they have come to one of the speakers like you saw in the presentation. But it is a really, really small population. It's tiny, and part of the problem is because they have these huge territories, they push each other out. So it might be that they're outside of our valley, and we wouldn't necessarily be surveying for them. But one of the things that that's been found in a lot of the studies, and a lot of the stuff I've read is by a guy called Richard Broughton, and one of his papers was in I want to say the Independent a little while back, and it was talking about a project that he'd been doing outside of Manchester, and they'd found that these territories were absolutely enormous for the willow tits. And the problem that they're facing is that when the chicks have fledged, they've left the nest and they've left kind of being fed by the parents, they will travel off out of the landscape, perhaps down a hedgerow or into a small woodland, or down a river corridor and that kind of thing. But they'll never see another willow tit along the way, or they'll never find the right kind of habitat to nest. They can feed perfectly well, but they never quite find the right place for them to make a nest. And that's why the numbers are so low in our valley, because we just don't have the space of suitable habitat for them. And obviously that's what's fueled the project.
Brilliant, thank you. So another one from Lawrence then here. What do they feed on? We manage a reed bed at Branston 4 times a year and would like to optimise habitat work for willow tit.
Okay, brilliant. So they feed a lot on insects. So in as much as any of the other tit species, they eat a very, very similar diet. So any of those kind of small little flies and vertebrates, they will take caterpillars and that kind of thing. But during the winter, they will feed on certain seeds. They've been known, they're very, very common at feeders. So again, one of the reasons we know that they're down at Lady Walk is they have feeders there. And that's how we've got a lot of the footage for the work that we've done for the video work and things, because they will come to the feeders and it means that you can catch them on camera. But obviously we're not going to go out and put bird feeders everywhere or plant sunflowers because that would be silly. But there has been mostly anecdotal evidence, again, not a lot of study, something I'm quite interested in trying to develop. But they will take seeds from things like hemp nettle and some of the burdock species, so things that have got a larger seed to them. They'll use those during the winter. So another part of the project that we're trying, it's one of those, we'll see how it goes kind of things, is to introduce some of those species. They're in the valley, but just to try and spread them out a little bit. So there's a lot of hemp nettle at the Whittaker Heath Nature Reserve, that's a Warwickshire Wildlife Trust reserve, but there isn't any, as far as I can see, at Lady Walk, and they're quite literally on opposite sides of the river from each other. And it's unusual that it's in the one place and not the other. There's no harm in us putting a few seeds down. Let's see if it grows up. If it does, then we're providing a food source for the birds over winter.
Brilliant, thank you. The next one from Kevin then. Dr. Willow Tit on Twitter is doing a lot of successful work designing willow tit nest boxes and monitoring their use. Are you liaising with the likes of them regarding their work and your project? I might have to look them up.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not directly liaising, no, but we will be now you've mentioned it. I have been aware of some of the willow tit nest box work that's gone on, and we do have some what would they be like, plans of what they look like, and the most common thing that people do is they will build a nest box, and it will have bark on the front of it. It'll have a piece of wood inside that's rotten, so the bird comes to the bark thinking it's a tree and sees this piece of wood inside and excavates that in much the same way that they would a tree. We will look at doing that. We will try it out. It's been successful, absolutely, in places. And again, at Lady Walk, they've trialed it, and they've, they don't seem to be having too much negativity from the blue tits. But for us, because we're so keen in kind of almost future-proofing the project, the kind of idea behind the deadwood is that we can put that up. We can put varying levels of rottenness of wood up, and then you're giving year on year amount of nest availability. With a box, we would have to keep going back to that box every year to put a new piece of wood into it. And whilst that might be a possibility, it might not be a possibility in the future. The dream for us is that we put up a few years worth of deadwood while we're waiting for deadwood to naturally happen in an area, and then it almost becomes its own thing and we don't need to do any more with it.
Absolutely, yeah. And then next one from Valerie then. I took part in a survey of willow tits with Staffordshire Wildlife Trust last year on Cannock Chase, and went to 12 sites and only saw them on one site. Do you know the results if it was a national survey?
I don't know, I'm very sorry. I have only been involved with willow tits since October. Prior to that, I was very much on the River Cole. So yeah, I'm very sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. The easiest place to probably find the answer for that might be the BTO, or to go back to Staff's Wildlife Trust, because they would also have fed that data in to something larger, so they should hopefully have the answer.
Yeah, I'd say, Valerie, if you probably go back to Staff's Wildlife Trust and ask that question, hopefully they'll be able to get back to you with that answer as well. That's it for questions in the chat. Unless anybody has any more that they would like to, you can unmute yourself and ask questions. I'll